Hey everyone, welcome back to the Is It Worth Watching show. I'm Jake, and with me is my awesome co-host Jill.
Hey guys, today we're diving into a super interesting chat we came across. It's all about the impact of stories on voter opinions in this crazy, meme driven political landscape. Buckle up, it's gonna be a wild ride.
So Jill, today's topic is fascinating. Do you think voters are more influenced by detailed stories about candidates or by the barrage of memes circulating during election season?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I honestly think memes have ramped up their influence. They're quick, catchy, and can sometimes capture the essence of a candidate or policy in a way that resonates instantly with people.
But aren't stories still crucial? They provide depth and context that a meme just can't. Like a well-told story can humanize a candidate, show their values, and build a real connection with voters.
True, but attention spans are shorter than ever. People might prefer to get their political cues from a meme that takes seconds to understand rather than a story that requires minutes of investment.
That's a good point. Maybe it's a balance of both. Memes catch the initial attention, and stories help deepen the engagement. I mean, have you noticed how every political conversation eventually circles back to Donald Trump?
Oh, absolutely. It's like he's the sun and everything else is orbiting around him. You can't escape it no matter whether you love him or hate him.
Exactly. And it's frustrating because there's so much more we should be discussing, like climate change, healthcare, education, stuff that genuinely impacts people's lives every day.
Instead, it feels like every campaign, no matter who's running, becomes a referendum on Trump. It's like every candidate is being graded on their stance about him rather than their own policies.
It really overshadows some really crucial and nuanced conversations we need to be having. All right, Jill, you ever get the feeling that we're living in a real-life soap opera with our political landscape these days?
Oh, absolutely, Jake. It's like we've swapped out serious policy discussions for a never ending reality TV show focused on personalities.
Totally. I mean, remember when debates were actually about what candidates would do in office? Now it's all about their tweets, scandals, and how they manage to stay in the news cycle.
Yep, and it's so frustrating because important issues like healthcare and education feel sidelined. All we talk about now is the mood or antics of whoever's in the spotlight.
So, Jill, it's like we're stuck in this never-ending Trump vortex. Every campaign now seems to revolve around how people feel about him.
Exactly, Jake. It's tricky because any significant policy debate gets overshadowed by his personality. Candidates are constantly being measured by their stance on him rather than their own ideas.
And when you consider how polarizing he is, it means campaigns often can't focus on real, actionable issues without it swinging back to Trump.
Right, and let's not forget how media amplifies this. They know that anything Trump related garners views, so they keep feeding the beast.
Breaking out of that narrative seems almost impossible. Even when a candidate tries to steer the conversation to policy, it somehow drags back to Trump. So, Jill, have you noticed how Biden's health is becoming a bigger discussion point lately?
Absolutely, Jake. It seems to be a matter that's hard to ignore, especially with the public appearances that make it pretty evident.
Yeah, and this inevitably leads us to a big what if scenario. If Biden's health continues to decline, Kamala Harris stepping in as president is a pretty plausible outcome.
And that's a whole can of worms, isn't it? There's already this strong divide in opinion about her. A presidency might intensify that divide, considering she brings different political approaches and priorities to the table.
Exactly. It could create a shift in policy direction and perhaps even strategy. And don't forget, it would also be historic. First female president and first woman of color. But politically, it's uncharted territory for sure. So, Jill, I've been thinking a lot about how much power swing voters have. It's kind of wild that a small number of undecided folks in just a few key states can basically decide the whole election, don't you think?
Absolutely, Jake. It's like we spend billions of dollars on campaigning and media blitzes, but in the end, it all comes down to this tiny fraction of the electorate. It's both fascinating and a little bit frustrating.
Exactly. And don't you think it also makes voter engagement super important? I mean, if just a few more people in those swing states felt motivated to vote, it could completely change the outcome.
For sure. And it really puts the spotlight on how campaigns target their messages. They're not just catering to the base, but also trying to sway these undecided voters who might tip the scales.
All right, Jill, let's dive into this elephant in the room, the electoral college system. It's always a hot topic, isn't it?
Absolutely, Jake. It's fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. The fact that a voter in, say, New York City can feel almost irrelevant compared to someone in Bucks County, Pennsylvania is mind-boggling.
Right? The system essentially magnifies the significance of voters in swing states. It's this bizarre game of political chess where only a handful of states really matter.
And what's more, this setup can lead to a candidate winning the popular vote but losing the presidency. Just look at Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if we're overdue for a serious discussion about whether this system still serves our democracy effectively.
Yeah, reforming or abolishing the Electoral College could make every vote truly count, not just the ones in battleground states.
Can you believe how much cash these political campaigns are throwing around?
It's wild. We're talking billions spent, but really, only a tiny fraction of voters matter. It's all about those few swing states and undecided voters.
Yeah, like a few 100,000 people basically determine the outcome. Makes you wonder if all that dough really makes a difference.
Exactly. And you could probably set those voters and their families up for life instead with that kind of money.
Plus, the local issues don't get as much attention because it's all national focus. Yet it's those hyper-localized votes that count. So Jill, gosh, it feels like no matter what happens, Biden's poll numbers are like an immovable rock, doesn't it?
Seriously, it's like the campaign is running through sand and not getting anywhere. We've had multiple debates, even that shocking assassination attempt, and still, his numbers just don't shift.
Maybe folks have already made up their minds.
Right. The needle barely budges, and it's fascinating to see how resilient voter opinions have become. It's like there's a buffer around him that events just can't penetrate.
So, Jill, with the potential impact of the Roe versus Wade repeal on voter sentiment and political alignment, where do we even begin?
It's such a monumental shift, Jake. I think it's driving a wedge even deeper between pro-choice and pro-life factions, making it not just about party lines but core values.
Absolutely. And it seems like it could galvanize younger and more progressive voters to turn out, maybe even redefining the priorities for 2024.
Right, and also shifting the focus from more traditional issues like the economy and foreign policy to civil liberties and personal rights.
It's a seismic shift that's bound to have ripple effects we haven't even fully realized yet. Did you catch that last state election, Jill? It's wild how much power one extreme candidate holds over people's perception of an entire party.
Absolutely, Jake. It's like the whole party gets painted with the same brush. One fringe candidate can make the entire party seem radical, even if the majority isn't.
Yeah, it almost feels like the loudest, most outrageous voices drown out the more moderate, sensible ones. It's both fascinating and a bit alarming.
And it has real consequences, too. Voters might shy away from the party altogether simply because of that one extreme figure. It's like a domino effect on public opinion.
Totally. And then it becomes a cycle. Parties start catering to these extremes to secure those votes, pushing them further out on the fringe. You know, it's wild how independent media has really shaken up the political discourse lately. Don't you think, Jill?
Absolutely, Jake. I mean, we're seeing these YouTubers and podcasters build gigantic followings just by being more relatable and honest, which is something mainstream outlets sometimes struggle with.
Totally. I think people are getting tired of the same old talking heads and are craving fresh perspectives, kind of like how we're trying to do here.
Exactly. And independent media often works without the same level of commercial pressure, so they can delve into topics that mainstream media might shy away from.
And yet, there's a flip side. Sometimes, without those editorial standards, misinformation can spread more easily. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be risky, but the upside is the diversity of voices and the democratization of information. It's become such an essential part of how people engage with politics now.
Have you ever noticed how much Twitter influences our political views these days? It's crazy how a tweet can set off a chain reaction.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in just 280 characters, someone can convey a lot of emotion and conviction, which really gets people talking and often fighting.
Yeah, and what's wild is how certain tweets can make or break a campaign. Remember that viral bot tweet scandal that shifted opinions overnight?
Totally. And those hashtag campaigns, too. It's like the modern day version of door to door canvassing, but way more instantaneous.
So, Jill, with all the craziness happening in the political scene, how much do you trust the polls these days?
Honestly, Jake, I think polling has become a bit like reading tea leaves lately. I mean, remember the shock in 2016? Everyone thought they had it all figured out, and then bam, Trump wins.
Exactly. And let's not forget that people often aren't super forthcoming about their political leanings. Some might even lie to pollsters.
Right. Plus, there's always that margin of error. A point or two can swing results dramatically, especially in a tight race. That's why every election night feels like a suspense thriller.
So, Jill, you know what's blowing my mind lately? How big of a player Elon Musk has become in politics.
Absolutely, Jake. The guy's got his fingers in so many pies, it's practically mind boggling. With his massive financial contributions and the sway he holds over social media, it feels like he's everywhere.
The fact that he's supposedly putting $500 million into the Trump campaign is just next level. Even if that's Trump being, well, Trump, it's still tens of millions at least.
Right. And remember how he basically moved to Pennsylvania to run key parts of the Trump campaign? Plus, his control over a platform like Twitter, now X, definitely amplifies his influence.
Exactly. It's like he's playing a game of 4D chess with our political landscape. And the reach he has, financial and social, makes him almost a behind-the-scenes kingmaker.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what are the broader implications for our democracy when one person has that much unchecked power?
So, Jill, you know what's been on my mind lately? The way mainstream media is really stuck in this bubble of elite perspectives.
Totally, Jake.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just what stories they choose to cover. It's in the language they use and the assumptions they make about what the average American cares about.
Yeah, it's like they're completely out of touch with regions and classes that don't fit their narrative. How can you really represent a country if you only focus on the coasts and forget about the heartland?
You know, Jill, weren't campaign debates supposed to be the cornerstone of democratic engagement? Like, giving politicians a space to really hash out ideas head to head?
Absolutely. But nowadays, it feels more like a relic from a bygone era. It's almost like the candidates are just too scared to make any mistakes.
Totally. And let's be honest, they're more likely to go on a friendly podcast than face an actual debate stage. You remember when debates really meant something? Now it's all about avoiding that viral gotcha moment.
Yeah, and I think that erosion of political norms, like skipping debates, is just diminishing the trust people have in the system. If politicians won't even face each other, how are we supposed to believe they'll face the issues?
So, Jill, do you think the Democrats are too focused on identity politics to the detriment of broader policy issues?
I think there's definitely some truth to that. They often emphasize specific identity groups in their policies, which, while important, can sometimes overshadow universal policies that could benefit everyone.
Exactly. Like they have these targeted policies for different groups. But wouldn't a more universal approach, like healthcare for all or increased minimum wage, potentially address the needs of those groups more effectively?
Totally. It's like they're trying to balance appealing to specific demographics without losing sight of larger, more inclusive solutions. But it's a tricky line to walk, and sometimes it feels a bit fragmented.
Yeah, sometimes the messaging can get so focused on those niche issues that it might alienate people who don't directly identify with those groups, even if the broader policies would benefit them too. Let's dive into this, Jill, because it's a really tough nut to crack for the Democratic Party.
Absolutely. Addressing men's issues can feel like walking a tightrope. They often emphasize inclusivity and equality, but there's this perception that men's concerns are sidelined, or worse, dismissed.
Totally. I think part of the problem stems from trying to balance different interest groups within their base. It's tricky to spotlight men's issues without being seen as undermining progress on gender equality.
Exactly. And it's not just about finding the right tone. There's a real need to connect on economic and mental health issues that disproportionately affect men, like job loss and suicide rates. But they struggle to frame it in a way that resonates politically without alienating their core supporters.
And the messaging just ends up feeling flat or half-hearted. Either way, it's a nuanced topic that definitely needs more attention in their strategy sessions. Have you noticed, Jill, how religion seems to be taking a back seat in American politics these days?
Definitely, Jake. It's like the left is almost scared to mention religion, as if it might alienate their core base. I think they're trying to balance the secular progressive crowd while not losing touch with religious voters.
Right. And then you've got the right, which has always leaned into the God and country narrative. But even there, it feels like it's more ingrained in tradition than actively shaping policies.
Exactly. And it creates this weird tension. If you're too outspoken about your faith, you're pandering. If you're not, you're ignoring an important part of American identity. It's a delicate line they're trying to walk.
It's fascinating to see how politicians are navigating this terrain, especially with the country's shifting demographics and increasing secularism. Who knows how it will evolve in the next few elections? So, Jill, one thing that's been nagging at me is Kamala Harris's positions and her overall campaign strategy.
Yeah, it's like she's trying to walk a tightrope. On one side, she's got to appeal to the progressive base that's often pushing for bold, systemic changes. But at the same time, she needs to keep more moderate voters on board too.
Exactly. And it feels like she's often too cautious, almost like she's scared to offend any particular group. That reluctance or hesitation could make her seem indecisive.
Right. And then there's the whole bit about her not differentiating herself from Biden much. If voters see her as just an extension of the current administration, she risks losing folks who are eager for change.
That's a good point. Without clear, definitive stances, her campaign might just blend into the background, which is risky in such a polarized and engaged political climate. So, Jill, have you noticed how male-dominated spaces like gaming and fitness seem to be leaning more right-wing these days?
Oh, definitely. It's like every other day there's a new controversy or influencer spouting some pretty conservative views. Do you think it's because these communities feel left out of the broader progressive agenda?
That could be it. Many of these spaces emphasize values like self-reliance and traditional masculinity, which tend to resonate more with right-wing ideologies.
And let's not forget that these spaces often value merit and achievement, especially in competitive gaming and fitness. That merit-based perspective can sometimes clash with progressive viewpoints on equality and social justice.
Absolutely. Plus, platforms and personalities in these spheres make it so easy to influence young, impressionable minds. It's like a domino effect.
Yeah, and once someone they admire starts talking politics, it's not long before those ideas start gaining traction within their own circles. It's fascinating and a little concerning to see how quickly these spaces can politicize.
So, Jill, did you catch Anna Kasparian's recent Substack post? It's causing quite a stir.
Totally, I did. It's interesting how she describes her political evolution. Despite claims of her moving right, it almost sounds like she's aligned more with the mainstream Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's a bit confusing. She still holds to some leftish views, especially on social safety nets, which are more Democrat aligned.
True, but her stances on crime and the border have definitely shifted right. Yet Kamala Harris has also taken some hawkish positions there, which sort of brings them closer together in some areas.
Exactly. It's like she's more vocal about the right-leaning points, but still maintains those core leftist values. Not exactly a full-blown conversion, right?
Definitely. It seems more like she's evolving within the framework of the existing Democratic spectrum instead of turning into a completely different political animal.
So Jill, Kamala Harris, the so-called border czar, has been under fire for her border policies. What do you think about the way she's handling it?
It's a tough situation, Jake. Politically, her approach seems like an attempt to thread the needle between securing the border and addressing humanitarian concerns. But it comes off as trying to appease both sides while satisfying neither.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tightrope walk. On the moral side, some argue she's not doing enough to protect immigrant rights, while others say she's not aggressive enough on security.
Exactly. And it's not just the policy itself, but also how it's perceived. Many feel that embracing a Republican-like stance might alienate some of her base.
Right? And that could be risky going into an election year. It feels like she's straddling a fine line, but not really making anyone happy. Wow, that was a deep dive into the labyrinth of the American political landscape.
Absolutely, Jake. It's fascinating to see how different aspects, from social media influence to candidate strategies, play such crucial roles.
It's a reminder that every little move counts, but often it's what happens behind the scenes that shapes the outcomes we see.
Politics can be such a game of chess, can't it? always strategizing, always trying to stay a step ahead.
Definitely. Well, folks, that wraps up today's episode. If you enjoyed our discussion, you might want to subscribe to this Is It Worth Watching channel for more engaging content. Until next time,